The boys are back in town. The Troika is back in town. They're all boys, of course. And there's a sense of Groundhog Day here, because last July when they were here, and they're going to come every 3 months to check out that the government is screwing the population appropriately. And I remember I was going on holidays and preparing a submission to them, and recently prepared another submission. So we'll start it exactly the same way. Because in July, and you might remember this, but I do, there was absolute turmoil in the markets and in the world generally. And we've said to them that Ireland will probably get 10 out of 10 for being a good boy. But you guys, 2 of you aren't doing your business. You're not giving us financial stability. That's the EU and the ECB are just, the ECB had just jacked up interest rates. It didn't even suit Germany. But it's really sad to have to say the same thing to the Troika again. And there's a great feeling of unease around Ireland. It's just, people are so scared. And people ask, why aren't you rioting? Because people are so scared. And people like you, people I know, who are financial experts, don't know what to do. People with savings, who've saved very hard, are really worried. People, all of us who have pension funds, including in the public sector, are worried. It's a time of great worry. My abiding feeling, I have to say, is that the lunatics are running the asylum in Europe and here in Ireland, that there is no real leadership. But the good thing about today is I think you'll hear a critical view on what's going on in the world that will inform you on what is, frankly, extraordinarily complex issues. And I don't know if there's anything more complex than regulation. And I'm here to introduce the section on financial regulation, but being a bold boy, I'm actually going to introduce the afternoon session as well, because I want to talk for a minute about corporate governance, 2 asinine words, I must say, but a terribly important business. So I'll speak briefly on corporate governance. I'm going to talk about the Honohan report on financial regulation, which I bet, did anyone in the room read it? Jimmy Stewart, I guessed he would have. Oh, and Anne-Marie. Good, because I think it's a very important report, because it's a lot tougher than you'd think, and I'll summarise it briefly. What needs to be done on regulation and private sector reform? They keep talking about the need for reform in the public sector. That is the dialogue in the media. I'll get back to that. And finally, I'll talk about what's going to be done now that our banks have failed. What do? We sell off the rest of our indigenous industry. That's the plan. It's just insane, this stuff. You know, if you think, it's insane. We have to sell off. Well, anyway, I'll get back to that later. Why is governance important? Well, what you find when you read the Honohan report in the typical language you'd expect from a central banker, it's very, subdued. But really, he says, the banks were run by herds of like-minded sheep or goats, I don't know which. The other side of it was that the financial regulator, and we keep thinking about that fella Neary, but you must remember also the board of the financial regulator was staffed by the great and good, Jerry Danaher, a barrister, Mary O'Dea, who I think still works in the central bank, the well-known financial expert Deirdre Purcell, an author, former actress and journalist, Dermot Quigley, former chairman of the Revenue, Alan Gray, an economist and friend of the former Taoiseach, an advisor, an important advisor, and Alan Ash, head of Standard Life, and John Dunn, former head of IBEC. Jim Farrell was the chair, but that was the board. It's worth remembering who these people were. It's worth thinking about who's advising, for example, the current Minister for Finance. Who is his chief economic advisor? A person who spent 10 years on the board of AIB. Has that had any impact on the way they're going after the bondholders? Far from me to suggest it. The dominance of the herd mentality of one voice, of one particular economic ideology in government, its institution, its advisory boards, on the boards of managements of Irish firms. There are independent auditors in the independent, question mark, or boo-boo around it, in the media and in the financial regulator was the cause of our downfall. And now we have the new fiscal council, an independent fiscal council. Sorry about that. The Honohan report, very quickly, it was November 2010, and it blamed the banks for borrowing externally and lending with abandon to anyone, especially in property, the directors and senior management of the boards. It was also critical, basically, of the government for leaving the same senior management in place after the taxpayer guarantee. That's fairly radical for a state institution. It shows it has some independence. And it was highly critical of the auditors and the accountants, and it should have included, in my opinion, the lawyers too. And of course, it was very critical of the financial regulator and of itself, the central bank. And its report was really about itself. It focused on it. And it said, at no point throughout the period did the Central Bank Financial Services Authority staff believe that any of the institutions were facing serious underlying difficulties, let alone potential insolvency problems, even at a late stage when the crisis neared. The whole business was principles-based regulation instead of rules-based. I haven't heard that there's much of a change there, though they are changing. Maybe the experts will fill us in more on that. There were too few staff, even though the financial regulator had a staff of, believe it or not, 350 people and 25 million of a budget a year. What were they doing? Playing tiddlywinks. Diffidence and deference were the hallmark of that body, said Honohan of the staff. He basically said that the financial stability reports that they published were whitewash, but that's my word, too strong for him. He looked at fine analytical articles. I actually looked at them for this myself, and I was surprised at well, he summarised it well. He says they're much too sanguine and based on selective evidence. And I think we're seeing that today in today's crisis. He basically accused them all of groupthink. And he also was critical of an obsession I have, that there can be too much competition. A lot of economists have an obsession with competition always being good. Well, it depends on the type of competition and whether it's too intense. And Honohan said, he said the competitive inroads of Anglo and UK-based retail lenders were part of the problem. And you remember you might remember the UK guys came in, would lend you 120% if you just said you want it and you're on the dole. Anyway, the financial regulator stood idly by. In fact, as you know, he cheered the insane lending. And the point is that that was the ruling ideology of the time. I myself sat on a government advisory board which recommended less regulation, particularly in finance. And of course, it recommended pro-cyclical cutting tax policies, even though we were running huge financial surpluses. Of course, I should say that I had a minority report on that with a colleague. Here's the thinking of Liam O'Reilly. He was the guy before Neary. Just shows you that it was going on. How long it's been going on. In November 2005, I won't read it all, I just read. He says, as I leave, I'm delighted because I've developed a more effective supervisory regime for the industry. And at that time, John Hurley, Governor of the Central Bank, in the Financial Stability Report of 2007 said, the overall conclusion is that the Irish financial, he knew something was coming down, so he said, the Irish financial system's shock absorption capacity remains robust, and the system is well placed to cope with emerging issues. So what you had was groupthink. what you have today is groupthink too. Read your Irish Times of yesterday and the Fiscal Council and the report. There's not one other word except that these guys are right for savage cuts. And there's a game being played, because those of us, the few voices arguing against austerity, though I think most of the population in the real world know it's really bad, but they're softening us up for a fairly savage budget. And frankly, it's not working. They said, oh, we had economic growth of 2.2% of GDP in it. OK, that's not important in Ireland, it's too volatile. But GNP was up by 1.1. But look behind those figures. Drill down and look at domestic demand, minus 2.2%. A further fall. Domestic demand is collapsing. In the domestic economy, where most of us work, things are really bad, and they're going to make them worse. Our leaders are going to make them worse. What needs to be done on regulation? Well, my view, and you'll hear, I hope, different views, is it seems that a lot is being done on regulation. The 6 stable doors of the 6 Irish banks are firmly closed, except the horses have fled. The Irish banks they've all collapsed. But it's good that they've done it. And my point is, private sector reform is more important than public sector reform. Is public sector reform important? Of course it is. Trade unionists are always wheeled out to defend the indefensible in the public sector. As a taxpayer, and as a representative of workers in the private sector, as well as the public sector who use the public sector, we must have the most efficient and dynamic public sector in the world. Has it been that way? No. Is this reform process good? I think it is, and it should be embraced, and we all should work to have the best public sector in the world, and we're capable. It's quite small, we can do that, and we are doing it. But what about private sector reform? And that's the subject for this afternoon. And my view is that private sector reform is essential, and basically at core is changing Irish company law radically from shareholder value to broadly stakeholder value. And there's a lot more beside. Matt mentioned the excellent, wonderful TASC report on the just tie-up of those incestuous directors. And you know, they haven't learned a thing. If you remember the interview with Lawrence Crowley, who's on more boards than you and I have had hot dinners, he said, well, of course, in a recent interview in the Irish Times, we wouldn't have anybody on a board that we didn't know, you know. In other words, unless they're grey-haired men or bald men with grey suits, it's not a suit, you know, the group think, OK, we're a small economy, it's difficult, but there's very few women on boards. I'm not saying that's the full answer either, before all the women grin too much, because if they're like-minded women to the guys running the show, it's fairly bad. All companies and all forms of enterprise need deep reform, as was it Matt who said about that it wasn't just limited companies that screwed up, it was a mutual, a building society, supposed to be a social thing, which was the Irish Nationwide, run by Fingers Fingleton, and him supervised by my old friend Michael Walsh, Professor Michael Walsh, who let Fingers do whatever he wanted. So much for independent directors. Jack Welch, the father of shareholder value, said it was a dumb idea when he thought back on it. And he said we should get rid of it, basically. I think getting rid of it and reforming Irish company law, and I'm saying something here that is not on the radar in Ireland. We really have to reform the way companies are managed in this country. And if you look at today's Irish Times and the business supplement, see a picture of 4 men, again, men, proudly grinning at you all because they won some award from themselves for corporate social responsibility, which frankly often is a load of trite nonsense. And I tell you, if you come looking for this, what we're talking about, these guys will oppose it. Because if you move away from shareholder value, you're going to stop the executive reward system that they have, and that's the key. And of course, it's the short-termism that leads to, which is part of the crisis. Is it even the PLCs, which are the better companies, the ones quoted in the stock exchange, at least they publish their accounts. But a recent Grant Thornton report last year showed that approximately half of all stock exchange companies were non-compliant with the code. It's a voluntary code. It concluded that the voluntary approach to the code had failed, and the only acceptable solution was to incorporate governance into legislation. That's what I'm looking for. And I hope to hear others argue this too this afternoon. There are too many exemptions. Most companies in Ireland don't publish accounts. Okay, small ones shouldn't have to, but there's a lot of public interest companies like the supermarkets, big suppliers, should publish accounts. I said years ago when Larry Goodman collapsed, if he'd had to publish accounts, suppliers would have got a smell of the badness going on, and they would have maybe rang the alarm bells earlier. The same with Sean Quinn and with Sean Dunn and with others. There are so many unlimited companies that are so important here. And by the way, if we change our laws, it's not good enough. In Europe, they allow any company with 2 operations, 2 member states, to amalgamate their accounts and not disclose. I think that's crazy. Of course, Europe is swinging to the right. So what is to be done now that all our banks have failed? Well, the next thing is the banks and Quinn were the 4 biggest indigenous companies in Ireland just 4 years ago. They've all collapsed. They're all hanging on in bits, helped by you, the taxpayer, greatly helped by you, the taxpayer. So what are we doing now that they've collapsed? We're selling off the rest of our best indigenous companies. This is why I think, what is going on here? Are they all mad? It's ideology at work, and you know it for sure when the Troika come in and say, okay, you agreed 2 billion in state asset sales, but we actually want 5. It's pure ideology. They don't give a tinker's curse about us having an indigenous enterprise centre in this country. So I'd conclude by saying that the area of regulation is very complex, but hopefully it'll be unravelled to you all today and you'll go away thinking clearer. I'm not sure if you'll be any more I think I have a combination of anger, frustration, and sort of despair and impotence. But hopefully, by talking together, we can sort of maybe boost ourselves, because frankly, a lot of us are people who do have an edge in the knowledge and in ways we're, I suppose, leaders. And we really need to work together better to give an alternative view. Thank you.